Well, we know one criminal in Tennessee who did not escape death row is Christa Pike, the only woman set to be put to death right now in our state for a brutal murder she was convicted of carrying out when she was just 18.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution in the mode prescribed by law, and that you shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And further, on the 12th day of January, 1997, your body shall be subjected to shock by a sufficient current of electricity. May God have mercy upon you. Mr. Bates, take Mr. Pike into the door.
Can I please have my mom before I go?
Mr. Bates, please hold Ms. Pike in the dock.
Please, let me just love my mom.
Please hold Ms. Pike in the dock.
I love you. I love you too. And I love you too.
On September 30th, 2026, Christa Pike is set to become the first woman executed in Tennessee in more than 200 years. This unprecedented event comes after years of legal battles, appeals, and heated debates. But how did an 18-year-old end up facing death row? What led her to commit one of the state's most talked about crimes? This is a case that begins with jealousy, anger, and a crime that shook an entire community. Christa Pike, at just 18, would find herself involved in an act of violence that would change her life, and the lives of those around her, forever. The real question remains, what drove her to do it? Was it a toxic relationship that spiraled out of control, or was there something deeper, something that pushed her to a breaking point? Stay with us as we uncover the details of this case, where personal conflict, mental health struggles, and impulses collided, leading to a crime that left the public questioning the fairness of justice. From the events of that night to the legal challenges that followed, we will explore the complexities of Christa Pike's case and the ongoing impact it has had on the state and beyond. If you want more in-depth coverage of true crime stories and the real mysteries behind high-profile cases, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a case that forces us to reconsider everything we know about crime, punishment, and youth. On January 12, 1995, Christa Pike, along with her boyfriend Tatterall Shipp and their friend Shadola Peterson, made a plan that would alter the course of their lives forever. The trio were students at the Job Corps facility in Knoxville, Tennessee, a program that helps young people build skills for a better future. What began as a day like any other would quickly take a dark turn. The victim, Colleen Slimmer, was also a student at Job Corps. At 19 years old, she had dreams of turning her life around. Pike, however, became convinced that Slimmer was too close to Tatterall Shipp, her boyfriend. Her jealousy began to fester, and she believed that Slimmer was trying to get closer to him, threatening her relationship. Pike's frustration grew, and it wasn't long before it led to a dangerous decision. On that fateful day, Pike and Shipp devised a plan to confront Slimmer. They invited her to meet at a secluded spot on the outskirts of campus, a place that students sometimes use to escape the pressures of their daily lives. Shadola Peterson, a friend of Pike's, was there, though her role in the incident remained secondary. What began as a conversation between the two girls soon escalated. Though the exact words spoken remain unclear, it's believed that tensions between the two women reached a boiling point. The confrontation between them quickly turned from verbal to something far more serious. Pike, who had already been struggling with deep feelings of jealousy and anger, seemed unable to control the situation. In a moment of rage, she took the situation beyond what any of them could have imagined. It was here, in this secluded spot, that Pike would make a decision that would lead to a life-altering event for everyone involved. What had started as a conflict rooted in jealousy turned into a life-altering moment for Colleen Slimmer, one that would forever impact the course of the investigation, the trial, and the public's perception of justice. Stick with us as we uncover the chilling events that followed. Christa Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in Beckley, West Virginia. From the start, her life was marked by instability. Her parents, Carissa Hansen and Emil Glenn Pike, had a volatile relationship filled with constant arguments, divorce, and remarriage. This constant upheaval shaped Christa's childhood. Her early years were full of emotional strain and neglect, and the one person who offered her any sense of comfort was her grandmother. But when her grandmother passed away, Christa was left without a support system, and the loss hit her hard. As Christa grew older, the neglect she experienced at home worsened, and she began to retreat into herself. Physical and emotional abuse from her parents further compounded her sense of isolation. She had few outlets for her frustration, and it was clear that she was struggling with intense emotional turmoil. By the age of 12, Christa's pain was so overwhelming that she made an attempt to end her own life. This early attempt at suicide marked the beginning of a series of struggles with self-harm and a deepening depression. Throughout her teenage years, these emotions intensified, and substance abuse became a way for her to cope with the weight of her inner pain. She turned to alcohol and drugs, attempting to numb herself from the turmoil inside. At the age of 15, Christa was placed in juvenile care, as her behavior became harder to manage. The time she spent in these facilities was not enough to address the root causes of her emotional distress, and her struggles continued. By the time she turned 18, Christa's mental health had deteriorated significantly, and she was in desperate need of a change. It was at this point that she enrolled in the Job Corps in Knoxville, Tennessee, hoping to leave behind the chaos of her past and start anew. However, this new environment didn't offer the escape she had hoped for. Instead, she quickly found herself tangled in a complicated relationship with Tatterall Shipp, a young man who would become central to the tragic events that followed. Christa's emotional instability and unresolved issues from her childhood soon began to surface in her relationship with Shipp, and the tension between them escalated rapidly. The jealousy Christa felt when she thought Shipp was paying attention to another girl would become the spark that ignited a violent confrontation. Despite the opportunity for a fresh start, Christa Pike's past, filled with emotional neglect, mental health struggles, and substance abuse, set the stage for a tragic and irreversible turn of events. Her inability to cope with the stress of her relationships and unresolved trauma pushed her down a dark path. What began as a personal dispute would soon spiral into a crime that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The investigation into Colleen Slimmer's murder began within hours of the crime. On the morning following the tragic event, Christa Pike was seen acting strangely among her peers. She casually showed a piece of Colleen Slimmer's skull to others, boasting about what had transpired the previous night. Her actions immediately raised suspicions among those around her, and it wasn't long before investigators started asking questions. Pike's behavior was deeply unsettling and ultimately became a key factor in the investigation. Authorities began by reviewing the Job Corps sign-out logs, which recorded the times when students left and returned to the facility. The logs revealed that Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and Shadola Peterson had all signed out together the night of the murder. However, when the trio returned to the campus, only 3 people returned. Colleen Slimmer was missing. This discovery alone was enough to set off alarms within the police department. The investigation then turned to forensic evidence, which would prove to be a critical part of the case. Investigators found a fragment of Colleen Slimmer's skull in Christa Pike's jacket, a discovery that tied her directly to the crime. The evidence was damning, and it became clear that Pike's involvement was undeniable. The authorities began questioning her, but Pike's actions and her strange behavior made it clear she had more to explain. Pike's bragging about the murder to her classmates only made the investigation easier. Witnesses came forward, reporting that Pike had openly talked about what had happened, even showing off the evidence. These statements would play a crucial role in building the case against her. The combination of forensic findings and witness testimony helped piece together the details of the crime. Within 36 hours of the murder, Pike, Shipp, and Peterson were all arrested. Pike, confronted with the overwhelming evidence, confessed to the crime. However, she claimed that the incident had gotten out of control, suggesting that the murder wasn't planned, despite the evidence showing otherwise. Her confession and the clear physical evidence left little room for doubt about her involvement. Tatterall Shipp and Shadola Peterson also faced charges, though their roles in the crime were seen as secondary to Pike's. Shipp, like Pike, was implicated in the murder, while Peterson, who was present at the scene, was charged as an accessory. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Pike's actions were central to the crime, though Shipp's involvement was undeniable. The trial of Christa Pike began in early 1996, just months after the tragic events that led to the death of Colleen Slimmer. Pike's defense team faced the difficult task of representing her in the face of overwhelming evidence. Despite the weight of the case, they sought to present Pike as a product of her troubled upbringing and mental health issues. In the courtroom, the prosecution presented strong evidence against Pike. Her confession to the crime, the skull fragment found in her jacket, and multiple witness testimonies from peers who overheard her discussing the murder were central to the case. The evidence painted a clear picture of Pike's involvement, making it difficult for her defense to counter the charges effectively. Pike's defense team argued that her actions were influenced by her history of trauma, including her difficult childhood and mental health struggles. They claimed that she was suffering from significant psychological distress, and that these factors should mitigate the severity of her actions. They pointed to her mental state at the time of the crime, trying to convince the jury that Pike's psychological condition played a significant role in the crime's escalation. Despite these arguments, the jury found Christa Pike guilty of first-degree murder. The evidence, combined with her confession and the testimony of witnesses, made it clear that Pike had played a central role in the murder. The jury's decision was swift, and they deliberated on the appropriate sentence. The sentencing phase followed the conviction, and Pike's defense once again brought up the issue of her mental health. They argued that her youth and history of abuse should be taken into account, urging the court to consider a less severe punishment. Pike's attorneys emphasized her age. She was just 18 years old when the crime was committed, and her emotional instability due to the abuse she had suffered as a child. However, the jury determined that the crime was too brutal and premeditated to warrant leniency. On March 1996, Pike was sentenced to death by electrocution, becoming the first woman in Tennessee to receive such a sentence in more than 2 centuries. The verdict was a pivotal moment in the case, as it raised important questions about justice and the death penalty, particularly for young offenders. Pike's defense team immediately filed an appeal, questioning the fairness of the sentence given her mental health history and the complexities of her age at the time of the crime. Yet, despite these efforts, Pike's sentence remained intact, and she would become a significant figure in discussions about juvenile justice and mental health in the criminal system. The sentencing of Christa Pike was met with mixed reactions. Some felt that the death penalty was an appropriate response to the brutal nature of the crime, while others questioned whether someone so young with such a difficult upbringing should face execution. Pike's case would become a symbol in the ongoing debate over the death penalty, particularly as it relates to mental health and the sentencing of minors. As the years passed, Pike's legal team continued to pursue avenues for appeals and post-conviction relief, arguing that her sentence should be reconsidered. However, Tennessee's courts upheld the original conviction, and Pike remains on death row to this day. The case of Christa Pike sparked a wide-ranging debate across the country, particularly around the use of the death penalty for someone so young. At the center of this debate was the question of whether an 18-year-old, someone who was still in the early stages of adulthood, should face such a severe punishment. Pike's defense team argued that she was a product of her troubled past and that her mental health struggles, which included bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), played a major role in her actions. They emphasized the challenges she faced growing up and how her unresolved trauma could have affected her decision-making at the time of the crime. While Pike's defense focused on her mental health, there was another powerful voice in the debate: Mae Martinez, Colleen Slimmer's mother. Martinez was an unwavering advocate for Pike's execution. For her, there was no question that the murder of her daughter demanded the highest form of justice. She argued that Pike's actions were brutal and premeditated, and that the death penalty was the only way to hold her accountable for the pain she caused. The legal debate surrounding the case was complex, as many questioned whether it was fair to execute a young adult, especially when mental health issues played a role in the crime. The juvenile death penalty debate was reignited, with some arguing that young offenders, particularly those like Pike who had experienced significant emotional and psychological trauma, should not face the death penalty. This line of reasoning highlighted the challenge of balancing justice with compassion, particularly when it came to someone so young and clearly struggling with deep psychological issues. Pike's defense team argued that rehabilitation rather than execution was the right course of action. They pointed out that at 18 she was still in the process of developing emotionally and mentally, and that sentencing her to death was a disproportionate punishment given her age and mental health. On the other hand, proponents of Pike's execution argued that the brutality of the crime justified the death penalty. They believed that her actions were too cold-blooded to warrant a lighter sentence, regardless of her age or mental state. The public reaction was divided, with some individuals supporting Pike's execution, while others believed that a more rehabilitative approach was the right solution. As the case progressed, it became clear that the issue of mental health in criminal cases would continue to spark debate. Should someone like Christa Pike, who had suffered from mental illness and trauma, be held accountable to the same degree as an adult offender? Or should her young age and mental health struggles be considered when deciding her fate? Pike's case ultimately raised questions about the fairness and ethics of capital punishment, especially for someone so young and vulnerable. The legal and public debate surrounding her execution would continue to influence discussions about the death penalty in the United States for years to come. Since her sentencing in 1996, Christa Pike has spent the majority of her life on death row at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. She is the only woman housed at the facility, and her time on death row has been marked by isolation and psychological distress. Pike's years in prison have been a constant struggle, as she has fought not only against her guilt but also against the weight of her future, the imminent execution hanging over her head. Throughout her time on death row, Pike has filed numerous appeals. Each appeal argued that her mental health issues, particularly her bipolar disorder and PTSD, should be taken into account when reconsidering her sentence. Her attorneys have emphasized the abuse she suffered during her childhood and the psychological trauma that accompanied it. They have argued that these factors significantly influenced her decisions, particularly during the events leading to the crime. Pike's mental health has been a central issue in her legal battles. Mental health evaluations have been conducted, revealing the depth of her struggles with depression and emotional instability. Despite these findings, however, the courts have consistently ruled against her requests for a commuted sentence. Her defense team continues to argue that Pike was not fully capable of understanding the consequences of her actions due to the lasting effects of her mental health issues. However, these arguments have not been enough to alter her sentence, and the court has upheld the original ruling. In 2012, Pike's time on death row took another unexpected turn when an escape plot was discovered involving Pike and an outsider. The details surrounding the plot were kept relatively quiet, but the discovery added to the already complex situation surrounding Pike's case. Though Pike was not charged in connection with the escape attempt, the incident raised additional concerns about her mental state and her ability to adapt to prison life. For many, it was another sign that Pike had not fully processed the consequences of her actions, and her behavior on death row remained erratic. As the years passed, Pike's legal team continued to fight for her life. Each appeal was carefully constructed, citing mental health, youth, and trauma as factors that should weigh heavily on the decision to carry out the death penalty. Despite these efforts, in 2025, a final date for her execution was set, September 30, 2026. If carried out, Pike's execution would make her the first woman in Tennessee to be executed in more than 200 years. Her execution has sparked renewed debates over the juvenile death penalty, especially for those with mental health challenges. Some argue that Pike, given her age at the time of the crime and the profound effects of her psychological issues, should not face the death penalty. On the other hand, there are those who believe that the brutality of her crime outweighs the mitigating factors of her youth and mental state. As the execution date approaches, Christa Pike's case continues to draw significant attention. Her case is at the heart of discussions about how the justice system should handle offenders with complex mental health histories, especially those who were young when they committed their crimes. The debate surrounding her fate is far from over, and the outcome will likely resonate far beyond Tennessee. The case of Christa Pike stands as a significant chapter in the history of capital punishment in the United States. It has sparked intense debates about the application of the death penalty, especially in cases involving young offenders. Pike's age at the time of the crime, just 18, raises critical questions about whether someone so young should face execution, particularly when mental health challenges are involved. Pike's mental health struggles, including bipolar disorder and PTSD, have been a focal point of the discussion surrounding her sentence. Her defense team has consistently argued that these factors should be considered in determining her punishment. However, the brutality of the crime, along with Pike's confession and the evidence against her, led to her conviction and death sentence. As September 30, 2026 approaches, Pike's case continues to divide public opinion. On one side, there are those who argue that Pike should be held fully accountable for her actions, pointing to the premeditated nature of the crime. On the other hand, many believe that the death penalty is an inappropriate sentence for someone with Pike's background, especially given her age and mental health history. This case raises important ethical and legal questions about the use of the death penalty in modern society. Should a young person, especially one with significant mental health challenges, be subjected to such a severe punishment? Is the juvenile justice system capable of addressing these complex issues effectively? As Pike's execution date approaches, the debate surrounding her case will likely continue to evolve. Her situation has become a focal point in discussions about justice, punishment, and the treatment of young offenders in the United States. What do you think? Should Pike face execution, or should her sentence be reconsidered, given her age and mental health issues? Drop your thoughts below.